for having me here, Mary and Sarah and the Conservancy and Chairman Davis. Thank you for giving me this stage and this opportunity to talk about the thing I do know the most about in front of the people I like the best in my favorite place. It's a really great opportunity to get to do this with you. And I'm thinking I'll talk for 45 minutes or an hour and hope we can get some Q&A. There's also a lot of people in this room who know more about, certainly about Methow ecology and science and some of the great stuff that's going on in Methow for solutions, so I want to get them engaged too. And I'm kind of surprised and amazed and delighted that you all showed up tonight. I was thinking, you know, A, it's a super hot night and the air conditioning helped, but I was also wondering a little bit about the sort of marketing of this event. We drove over last night and we stopped at the museum store on our way in, and I saw the poster for the first time. And I don't know if people have seen it. It's got the same title, but the picture is rather less inviting. It's a picture of one of the big forest fires blowing up, and it looks like a mushroom cloud. It looks like, and you know, and it says climate solutions in little bitty writing, and it says age of consequences. And I go up to the deck at the museum store and the sign, and there's these people are looking at the sign at the poster and going, "Oh, that sounds like a lot of fun." But, come on, I mean, let's go tomorrow night and hear about Armageddon. Tell us about consequences. Sort of suggests that there are limited entertainment options in Twisting. For that, I am grateful. Let me tell you just a little story that helps me, a true story that actually happened to me that sort of helps me kind of set the context for the work I do. I commute to work by bicycle, mostly for health and sanity reasons, partly as part of my campaign to liberate myself from fossil fuels. And I was riding into downtown Seattle one morning on my bike, and the first thing I had to do that morning was a presentation. So I didn't go to the office, I locked up my bike on 4th Ave downtown at the Y where I go work out, and I had to walk a couple blocks to my presentation. And I had a little bit late, like I usually am, and I've got my 2 overstuffed panniers that I'm hauling off of my bike. I've got my gym clothes in one, and my laptop in the other, and I'm locking my bike and hustling down the street, looking a little kind of late and, you know, kind of awkward with my 2 big bags. And so I'm walking down the street, and this guy pops up, who's sitting on the sidewalk, pops up and starts walking along next to me. And he looks at me, and he looks at my panniers, and looks at me again, and says, "Hi, how you doing?" I said, "You know, hi, good, I'm kind of late, I'm trying to go," and sort of trying to shake myself loose a little bit. And he looks at the panniers again, and he has this quizzical look, and he says, so what do you do for work? And I say, "Well, I work on solutions to global warming." And you can see he's scratching his head, looking, yeah, okay, Mike dude's going to save the world, right? But he keeps walking along beside me. And then, you know, the quizzical look kind of moves aside, and this light bulb goes off over his head, and he says, "Well, say, do you have any work I could do? Because I need a job, and you are going to need a lot of help." I do need a lot of help. He was right about that. And I want to spend the rest of the night trying to enlist you. And I tell that story because it really helps kind of blow the lid off of how we think about this issue. I think most people are used to thinking about climate as an environmental issue. And when we say environmental issue because of the way our culture works and our politics works and a variety of historical reasons, we mean something pretty specific. We mean that what we need to do is limit the adverse impacts of the way our economy functions and the way we produce goods and services. We kind of have to clean things up a little bit and sand the rough edges off and protect a little bit where we can because of the adverse things that our economy does if we don't protect it. Well, that whole idea of limiting the adverse impacts of the way we produce things, the way we use energy and live our lives, is just way too small for trying to solve a problem like climate change. It's so much bigger than that. It's really about completely re-engineering how we produce energy, how we produce goods and services, how we live good lives on the planet. And on the one hand, that's a lot more interesting and fun and exciting than just sanding the rough edges off the adverse impacts the way we do things now. But it's also a lot more complicated. The good news about it, and Phil's board asked me this, the first question that Phil's board asked me for their meeting tomorrow night is this all doom and gloom, or is there anything good? Well, the good news, the good thing is that when we set about that re-engineering process and reimagining how we produce goods and services, how we produce energy, it turns out there's a lot of ways to do it that would actually help us create stronger economies, healthier communities, better lives. And so, at the end of the day, we better have a job for the guy who walked along beside me. We better have an answer for how the 2 billion people in the world who have no modern energy service are going to be able to enjoy decent lives and economic opportunity and basic energy service. We have to rebuild those things. We have to engineer those things. And that's the exciting part. That's the good news. It's not easy, but it's going to be great. Let me give you an example of how this is working already in Washington. This is the Centralia coal plant, the largest source of climate pollution in Washington State, about 10% of our entire emissions. The City of Seattle sold our share of that plant in 2000. We went completely carbon-free for the whole City of Seattle, not just the municipal buildings, but the whole community. Completely carbon-free power in 2005. We have some of the lowest rates and the cleanest air in the country. The lights still stay on. We have no carbon in our power supply at all. And it started with getting rid of this power plant. But we just sold our share and the power plant continued to operate. In 2011, we reached an agreement to phase this plant out completely, transition this plant off of coal and into the past where it belongs. And the amazing thing about that agreement is it had the unanimous support of the workers at the plant, the company that owns the plant, the state legislature, the local community, all agreed that it was time to move beyond coal to a new energy era. Now that kind of consensus and agreement could not have been possible. It couldn't have been thinkable if we had not spent 15 or 20 years before that proving that we've got a better way to provide modern energy service. And the biggest part of that story, and I'll talk more about it if we have time later, is the energy that we saved. Now this often is in the background. You think of the clean energy transition, you think wind, solar, and all the things we're going to produce. The biggest part of the clean energy transition is the energy that we're going to stop wasting. This has been the biggest energy story in the Northwest by far over the last 20 or 30 years. We have saved 5 Seattle's worth of power in the Northwest through better buildings, stronger energy codes, more efficient industrial processes. And that energy that we saved cost half as much as energy we would have had to produce from coal and nuclear plants had we built them, but we didn't need to because we saved the energy. And we're saving over $2 billion a year on our electricity bills in the Pacific Northwest because of these investments. I'm an energy efficiency nut, and I'll talk more about this later, but that's not all we did. We're also starting to build smart energy systems. The energy system is going through a transformation that looks like what the information and communication revolutions did to information technology and computer technology. It's going to look less like a mainframe and more like a network, more like a web, with more sources of energy connected and more transactions. The Northwest is a leader in this technology, and it's a big part of the energy revolution. We're bringing on new renewable resources in addition to our hydro base in big quantities now. You see a lot of wind turbines in eastern Washington producing cost-effective electricity. Solar, wind, geothermal, tidal are all beginning to come online in meaningful ways. We'll talk more about Methow solar later. And this energy transition is one of the biggest drivers for new sources of prosperity, new jobs in rural Washington and urban Washington alike. Unbelievable success story that's unfolding now in Washington. And as a result, we were all able to agree, former foes, environmentalists, and labor and business, that it was time to shut down that coal plant. We've got a sight line from here to being the first coal-free state in the country. This was our only coal plant in the state. We still use some coal from out of state, but we're working on making that transition as well. So fantastic success story. And you know, the thing about it is, of course, it's not just dramatically reducing our carbon emissions and helping with the climate problem. It's doing all this other stuff. And people see what's on the slideshow up there. People see in the back, okay? Yeah, okay. This is now has become a staple of climate presentations everywhere. Everybody does climate presentations, loves to show this slide. Because one of the things that we climate folks talk about a lot, because it's sometimes hard to talk about climate, is all the great things that will happen when we make the transition from fossil fuels to the clean energy era. And we find that a lot of those things over on the right are a lot more accessible to people. They seem less political, they seem less controversial, they seem more human and local. And so our climate communication professionals tell us, focus on those, focus on the co-benefits. You're scaring the crap out of people with the climate stuff. Talk about energy independence, talk about green jobs, talk about sustainability, and so we do. And I think it's been very successful. We build bridges to people who would otherwise have a really hard time talking about this stuff by describing all of those co-benefits. So I'll continue to do that, but I also have come to the conclusion that there's some shortcomings in only talking about co-benefits. The psychologists say that when you talk about all those things, you're basically saying, do it if it feels good. And what that does is, they say, it deactivates moral intuition. It tells people, this isn't a right or wrong issue. This is a do it if it feels good issue. This isn't something we have to do. This is something we'll have some benefits, and when we like the benefits, then we'll do a little more. When we don't, we'll do a little less. So I want to tell you, I believe in all those benefits. I believe it's going to be a fundamentally better world in 100 ways when we make this transition. But in saying that, I do not need to imply for a moment that it's optional. This is something we have to do. And when we have to do something, we always have to think about what Winston Churchill would say, because he was arguably the most successful historical figure in convincing people that they had to do something that they didn't really want to have to do with. And so I offer this quote, which has become, most of you will probably recognize it, kind of a classic in the history of motivational speech when Churchill was trying to engage and call out and cajole the reluctant Brits to fight the fascists in World War II. He said, I have nothing to offer but sweat, blood, toil, tears, and sweat. I'm not going to say that to the board tomorrow night. We do have more to offer than that, but it's interesting that that's how he chose to say it this way. No sugarcoating. Nothing about this is good. And why did he do it that way? Because he was trying to lay bare that it was something they had to do. It was an imperative. I imagine that he might also say this. Right? And what did that do? It got across the message that this isn't a do it if it feels good thing. This is, our moment has come, it's something we have to do. He also said this, you might have seen this quoted in Al Gore's movie. I love his language. It's like, strip away every, excuse, everything good. We have entered a different kind of era. And he called it the period of consequences. That's where I got the age of consequences thing. Unfortunately, this period of consequences is going to be too long to call it a period, so I had to call it an age. We struggled with that in climate solutions. Should we call it the era? Should we call it an age? And the reason that we're using that now is because, as near as we can tell, 2012 really was kind of a landmark. And I wonder if this rings true for all of you. In going from a time when people were still kind of scratching their heads, still wondering what's going on, to experiencing the impacts in a really vivid way. It was Hurricane Sandy. It was the fact that half the counties in the United States were declared disaster areas because of drought. It was the uncanny increase in extreme weather events across the country. And it seemed to have kind of clicked in people's head that this isn't about computer models anymore. This is about the water coming up in the subway. This is about whether I can grow food on my land. This is happening. And that creates kind of a different context for this whole discussion when people are actually experiencing it. And they're experiencing not just an anecdote about what happened in my place, but then they're looking at the map and seeing all the other things that happen and kind of going, whoa, this is systemic, this is systematic, this is something big that we need to get our arms around together. And I think that has had, I mean, it's scary, but it's having a real effect, I think, in terms of our ability to start to talk about big solutions, start to engage people, not just because there's going to be a lot of co-benefits, not just because it's going to feel good when we do it, but because we have to do it. Now, when we start talking about it, I'm really glad there isn't anything else going on. It's what it's been when we start talking about stuff you have to do, right? To last, we're all adolescents at the end of the day, you know? Oh, great, Mom's going to talk about consequences now. That's going to be fun. So you always worry about what happens to the audience when you start getting too far into the consequences. I'm going to do some of it, but I'm going to issue a warning first, and I wish Al Gore would have done this before his movie. We're going to get sad, but we've got work to do. So just hang in there with me. We're going to talk a little science. If I haven't already bummed you out, just a little bit more. We're going to talk about some local impacts, and then we're going to get to it. So first, you know, we are going to talk about local impacts because it's really, I mean, especially here, we're all localists, right? We all love this, our place, this place. We all identify with this. And so that always comes first, and that's where our hearts are. So we'll talk about that, but I really want to remind you at the outset, we can get a little parochial. I mean, our valley is a beautiful thing, it's a wonderful thing, and we're going to talk about what it means to our valley. But this is kind of like the whole thing, the whole world. So here is what one of the most eminent climate scientists from the UK had to say. The current path up toward a change in the global average temperature of 4 degrees centigrade, which we're easily on that path now, is incompatible with organized global community. So we're not talking about a little less snowpack, a little bit more forest pests. We're talking about the ability to feed ourselves. We're talking about whether people have water. We're talking about hundreds of millions of environmental refugees, organized global community. Too much to adapt to. Yes, we've got some adapting to do, but we've got to have something left to adapt to. We've got to stabilize it so we can adapt. If we stay on this path, we're beyond adaptation, devastating the majority of ecosystems. High probability of not being stable. You know, you think people want to ask, well, what's going to happen if we have, you know, have this much temperature rise or what? And the truth is, you don't know where it stops. There's all kinds of feedback loops in the system. You don't know. We're kind of walking around in a minefield with our eyes closed. And we don't know when we're going to hit something that goes way beyond even what the models suggest. So our research director happened to be absent on the day that this report was released. So when the media called, they had to talk to me, and I was so upset that this was kind of all I could muster. And my son thought that that was a somewhat insufficient answer and was a little bit flip on my part, so he had something to say too. Okay. PowerPoint is so much fun. I can't help it. So another thing that I think happens when people absorb this information is, you know, there was a period there where there was a lot of money spent on paid denial. And there was the whole ClimateGate thing with the email scandal. And most people aren't paid to sort out the facts. And you turn on one cable news channel and it says it's a catastrophe. Turn on the next cable news channel and you say it's a hoax. Maybe this is going back and forth. And I think your tendency, since none of us are experts on this, is you want to kind of split the difference. You want to say, well, maybe it's not as bad as they said. Maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. The truth is not somewhere in the middle. These are the various model projections of what happens to Arctic sea ice extent. Turns out the Arctic sea ice is a kind of major geologic feature that has a lot to do with weather patterns all over the world. It's not just polar bears. And this was what the models were telling us, that it would decline on kind of that curve. This is where it is as of 2012. Now, not everything is worse than the models suggest. It's a mixed bag. There's a lot of variables out there, but for the most part, the things that we thought were true 5 or 6 years ago, things are getting worse much, much faster than the scientists predicted, which is predictable in a way when you think about it, because the incentives for scientists are to be as conservative and careful and irrefutable as they can possibly be, because they know they've got somebody paid by the fossil fuel industry to go through every one of their emails, find any little flaw, and say this is a big exaggeration. So their professional culture is downplay the risk. Only say the things that you're absolutely positive about. And as a result, it turns out that they predict somewhat less change than what we're actually experiencing. It's getting bad quickly. This was the 2006 Time magazine cover. It was actually a very good issue, but I show it because it's sort of a classic in how not to communicate about climate. I mean, it's everything about it is wrong. It's sort of, you know, from the beginning, it's, what kind of issue is this? Well, there's a spotlight right on the answer. It's a polar bear issue, right? It's not a people issue, it's not a food production issue, it's not a water issue. You know, and for most people, to be honest, there's probably a lot of people in this room who love polar bears. For the record, I love polar bears, but for most people, you know, I gotta get my kids to school, I gotta put food on the table, I gotta think about college, I gotta think about the mortgage. You know, polar bears are just not in the top 10 of things that most people have to worry about every day. And this suggests that it's that remote, that it's in the Arctic, it's out there somewhere. The other thing that I find really objectionable about this is kind of the psychology and the timing of it. Being worried is sort of something that you might want to do if A, you didn't have any control over it, it was something that was going to happen to you, and B, it was sort of a prospect out there somewhere in the distant future. Well, here's the New York Times from October of 1956 saying that carbon dioxide, warming may be due to carbon dioxide in the air. 1956, they were starting to talk about this theory. And in that article, they talked about a theory that was held a half a century before that. So that was 100 years ago in 2006. That would have been a good time to be very worried. That would have been a splendid time to start being worried. But here we are now, 100 years later. By 1988, the foremost scientists, climate scientists in America, went before Congress and said, the studies are in, the data is in, we've got big problems on our hands, and we've got to start doing something about it. And the people who were following the science really knew a decade before that. But by that time, a NASA scientist, a public employee, could go before Congress and say, we are so certain that you've got to do something about this. 1988 was before my oldest kid was born. My oldest kid will come up tomorrow to the Methow, having just graduated from college. And we still have no national climate policy. We are still in the infancy of thinking how we're going to respond to this. So what I want to suggest to you is that A, this isn't optional, and B, it is long past time to be very worried. It is time to be determined. It's time to be scared, if you can turn fear into action. It's time to be frustrated and upset and impatient with our leaders that it has taken this long. And it is time, above all, to be the solution ourselves, which we're going to spend most of tonight talking about. But before we do that, we're going to geek out a little bit on local impacts. I'm going to go through this part fairly quickly. These slides were provided by the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group, which is, by the way, one of the very best group of regional scientists working on local and regional impacts. So they got a ton of great stuff about watersheds and all kinds of wonderful stuff. I am not a scientist myself. I will say some of these slides have, graphs with like logarithmic scales and all kinds of stuff that, you can spend a kind of a while scratching your head and going, now, what exactly is that? Now, we're not going to do that. We've got a whole bunch of work to do at the end on solutions. So I want to spend a little bit of time going through local impacts at about the level that I understand it, knowing that many of you understand it somewhat better, but that it's really important to just get a look at what it means for the Methow, and the UW folks have given us some great information for that. And as we go through, don't forget, it is about our place, but it is about the whole thing. Okay, Pacific Northwest temperatures. I am going to spend a little bit more of a minute on this slide because it's pretty intuitive. This is the projected trend in the average temperature for the Pacific Northwest. Again, remember, this is average temperature. A lot of the bad stuff is about extremes and that sort of thing, but just average temperature warming, which drives all that other stuff. The red and the yellow are two of the main climate models that are now used. They differ a little bit, and what's called the error band around this is the level of uncertainty on these. So you see the projected changes in the 20s, 40s, 2080s. You see it could be from, south of 2 to as much as almost 10 degrees Fahrenheit change in the average temperature this century. And you think, wow, 3 to 10 degrees, that's a pretty big range. A lot of uncertainty. The science is still pretty loose on some of that. Turns out most of that uncertainty is not science uncertainty. It's not about how the climate and the temperature will respond to a given level of climate pollution in the atmosphere. It's uncertainty about how much climate pollution we will in fact produce. So what goes into these models that makes them so different is one of them assumes something like, a decent effort to reduce fossil fuel consumption and transition to clean energy. One of them just assumes that we keep sailing off the cliff and expanding our fossil fuel use all over the globe. So the good news about that is those are choices. That's not science uncertainty. That's not modeling error. That's what we choose to do. It's what kind of energy future we build. It's whether we choose to make the transition from fossil fuels in a way that preserves a world that we can think about adapting to. The models kind of go all over the place on precipitation. Most of them show a little less precipitation in the summer, a little bit more in the winter, but you can get the scientists to say, yeah, we're not that sure about that. And of course, it'll vary year to year. These are all about averages and means and all that kind of stuff. What they will tell you with very high confidence is that we're going to lose snowpack, because the precipitation that does fall, a lot more of it's going to fall as rain, a lot less of it's going to fall as snow, which means it's coming down the river in the spring and the winter when we don't need it, and it's not available in the summer when we do need it. This is the signature and biggest impact for a region like ours. So here's the Methow River flow at Winthrop over the course of the year, 2020, 2040, 2080, and historical. And you can see it kind of moving down and shifting over toward more flow coming down in the winter. And you say, well, yeah, but the difference isn't really that much. But let's look at today, beginning of July. Typical year, it would be 1,700 in Winthrop. I think it's quite a bit more than that now. It's pretty high with the hot weather and the decent snowpack this year. But that would be our average for the beginning of July going through Winthrop. This would be the average, within, mid-century or so, you're talking about half as much water in the river on an average early July day. So significant changes in hydrology for the Methow. Here's the number of weeks, let's see, average weekly water temperature for the river. And this shows sort of the span of time on average that the temperature would be getting above 13 degrees C. And someone in this room probably knows a lot more about salmon than I do, but 13 degrees C is when it starts to get tough for salmon to reproduce and to spawn. They still survive at 13 degrees C, but it starts to get difficult to be a salmon in that kind of weather, and more weeks are going to be like that. Here's what the salmon habitat picture looks like. The solid areas are air temperature, and the little dots are stream temperatures. And you can see, more and more of Washington going into the zone of stressful to fatal for salmon. And the favorable for salmon is, of course, all up in the mountains at the higher elevations. Problem is, if you're a salmon, you kind of got to get from here to there, so you got to cross some pretty stressful to fatal conditions to get from the mountains to the ocean, which salmon have to do. It's just the way they are. Everything that I just showed you was about means and averages and statistics, really. It's important, but it's never what's happening at any given moment. What happens because of these temperature changes are the extremes. The weather extremes, the hydrologic extremes, the fire system extremes. This is the costly stuff. This is the stuff that's harder to adapt to. You can imagine those slow changes in the averages. We'll figure out some things we can do to compensate for that. The extremes are pretty tough to compensate for, to adapt to. And we're talking about, much more serious conditions for forest fires. Throughout the Eastern Cascades. We've had a relatively mild this year. We had a decent winter and a relatively wet spring, I think, and cool. We had La Nina the last few years, so fire seasons haven't been as bad. The rest of the West this year is really going to be tough. Colorado is in hard times already. California and Oregon are going to have a hard time. And you should never think we had a couple of good years, therefore maybe this isn't happening. It's always going to go down. Interannual variation is always going to happen. La Nina and El Nino are still going to happen. So things are going to go up and down, but you can't take your eye off the ball that this forest disturbance problem is huge. And it's about drought conditions, it's about temperatures, it's about the pests that survive at rates that they didn't used to survive, and these infestations spreading because they aren't killed off by the hard winters the way they used to be. Moving to the coast, because I just did a presentation for some people on the coast, and I know some of you spent some time over there. This is what a 3-meter sea level rise looks like in Seattle. 3 meters, by the way, is probably a little more than we're going to get in this century by most models. But of course, it keeps going on for many centuries. So 3 meters is within sight, within 100, certainly within 150 years. And there goes the Duwamish. Seattle has a lot of topography, so it's not, you don't get the kind of inundation that they do on the East Coast from Boston, let alone Florida. Most of Florida starts to disappear when you get this kind of sea level rise. And again, this is about a century or so out. On current rates, if we choose not to have a clean energy revolution, let me always remind us of that. And then just to go away from the local for a minute, you know, it's just so important to remind ourselves, this is Bangladesh with 1.5 meters of sea level rise. That is well within the sights for before 2100. That kind of sea level rise would displace about 17 million people, hundreds of millions of people worldwide in Bangladesh and other low-lying areas, mostly in Asia. And the reason I include this is partly just the physical impacts, but also to remind us that as sad and scary as the impacts in the Methow can be, we are among the people on the planet who are probably best situated to figure out how to get to higher ground when the water comes. These people are not, and they did almost nothing to cause the water. This is the great global injustice of climate disruption. The people who did the least to cause it feel the impacts first and worst. So it's not just about how it affects us locally. It's about how what we're doing affects everybody, particularly the people who have the least ability to get out of the way and did the least to get us into this mess. Now, all that was just, you know, sea level rising slowly over a century. Of course, that, again, is not going to be the big problem because it, you know, still kind of happens slow. You can see the water coming a mile away. The problem is how this affects extreme events and floods. It contributes very heavily to flooding, erosion, habitat loss, and all this happens way before the sea level actually comes up and slowly covers these places, as they found out in dramatic fashion in New York and New Jersey this year. This is a good storm, a foot of sea level rise, a storm surge at the right time, coming together and devastating tens of millions of dollars in damage. I can't remember how many lives lost, 40, 50, 60 lives lost in Hurricane Sandy. And these kind of events are happening with more frequency around the world. Now this has been really helpful to me in thinking about how you think about impacts, because you can kind of get put to sleep by these slow curves that go out over time, and you think, well, I'll have forever to deal with that. A 1-foot sea level rise, which we've already had, will have at least 3, probably 6, maybe 9 feet of sea level rise this century. A 1-foot sea level rise turns a 100-year flood event into a 10-year flood event. So if that sea level rise is triggered by fossil fuel burning, and people say, oh, well, we've always had storms, you can't attribute that to climate change. Well, you can say, okay, 9 out of 10 of these, since we now have 10 of them where we used to have 1, are attributable to climate change. Now, you could pick which 9, but you can't say that they're not attributable to climate change. With 2 feet of sea level rise, a 100-year flood becomes an annual event. I tried to get the University of Washington people to tell me if you could translate this to rivers, if this same kind of sort of math, this kind of logarithmic change applied to river flooding. And she gave me one watershed that sort of gave you an idea of it. But the same basic principle applies. It's about the extreme events, and the extreme events are going to come much faster and much more furious because of these flow changes in temperature and water levels, sea level, and that sort of thing. Let's talk a little bit about ocean acidification. Ocean acidification is not climate change, but it is caused by the same thing. It's caused by the carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels, about a quarter of which, 3/4 went into the atmosphere, about a quarter of it ended up in the oceans, where it is slowly increasing the pH of the ocean and turning it into acid. Acidity is up 30% already from human activities. It's on pace to go up 100 to 150%. For a variety of reasons, it's a particularly big problem in Washington and Oregon just because of the way our ocean currents work and some of the runoff patterns in Washington and Oregon. It is very bad news for what are called calcifiers, all the things in the ocean that use calcium carbonate to produce shells, the yummy stuff, the oysters, the crabs, the mussels, the gooey ducks. But it's not just about shellfish, it's also about the base of the food chain. The plankton turn out to be calcifiers as well. And almost everything on up the food chain depends on the planktons, which is why a new nonprofit organization has been formed. This is the beautiful pteropod. You don't think about plankton very much, but you get up close and they're really kind of extraordinary. Really hard, just mind-boggling. Some of the best work anywhere in the world is on ocean acidification is being done here in the Northwest because we have to. The oyster industry in particular has started to experience some really significant impacts. These are healthy oyster larvae on the left, and oyster larvae in excessively acidic conditions that actually occur now in Puget Sound. And as a result, the oyster industry has had to move the early larval stage of their oyster farming out of the Puget Sound. So we've already started to lose jobs in the seafood industry because of this. So there you go, that's a little taste. We can talk a little bit more about science, but I can see that we're getting to the point where some of you are ignoring my earlier warning. And we're going to call that enough for now. We could show lots more pictures. We could have a whole disaster porn evening if you want. But we're not going to do that. We're going to turn now to the work we've got to do to prevent this. Because remember that first slide about the average temperatures. The difference between 3 degrees and 10 degrees is what we do. It's what kind of energy feature we choose. So let's start with how to choose the right stuff. And let's, before we do that, do a little psychology. So you can curl back in a ball, go lie down on the couch for a second while I do a little amateur psychology, because I've been talking to people about climate a lot, and I realize that there's still a lot of this out there when you go around and talk about climate. And our usual mental model is, okay, well, the reason that people aren't acting is because they're still confused about the facts, or they're still in denial about the facts. So we go out and trot out the scientists, and we clear up the denial, and then surely people will act, right? Because we're rational. It turns out it's not quite that simple. It's actually partly the inaction that's causing the denial and confusion. I'm a little bit of a skeptic of communication research, but the best result we ever got from a focus group was the woman who said to us, I think it's a big issue, nobody's doing anything about it. Right? I mean, this is a brilliant insight when you think about it. They say this on this cable channel, they say that on that cable channel. I don't know, how am I supposed to know? The way I would know is if, surely if it was as bad as Al Gore says, the responsible authorities would be doing something with urgency and resolve, and they're not. So this is a logical deduction for most people to make. Climate Solutions strategy is based on breaking that vicious circle and replacing it with a virtuous circle, engaging people in practical and economic solutions in their places, and working with public policymakers to pass results-oriented climate policy, and then getting these things to reinforce each other, because the more people see themselves as part of the solution, the bigger the constituency, the more the votes, if you will, for strong climate policy, and the better the climate policy we have, the more economic opportunity, the more places there are for people to be part of the solution. And this is the virtuous circle that will ultimately overcome climate disruption. This is what we do in Climate Solutions. So let's do it, right? It starts with recognizing that, whoever came up with this, yes, it's global warming. Yes, this accurately describes that average mean temperature in the global average temperature, but nobody lives in the global average temperature. Nobody works or plays or gets anything done in the scientific abstraction of the global average temperature. And the first step to making it real, making it something we can do something about, is realizing that when you talk specifics, it is very much a local issue. When you think about how we experience the impacts, we don't experience the global average, we experience this here in the Methow because of the global average. When you talk about how we cause the problem, we cause it not at the UN, We cause it in our cars, in our land use practices, in the way we choose energy, in the energy economy, in the infrastructure we've built. That's what we're doing. We do most of it locally. We make most of the decisions about how much we have to drive, what kind of alternatives do we have to drive, what kind of vehicle emission standards do we have, state and local decisions. All of that in our hands here in Washington and our communities. And most of all, when you roll up your sleeves and think in practical terms, as so many of you do in this valley, in your lives, about how we're going to solve this thing, so much of the action is local. Now, I don't mean to say for a minute that we don't need a national climate policy and an international climate treaty. It is a travesty, it is shameful that this nation above all, alone among all the advanced economies in the world, has no national climate policy. We need one, we're going to get one. In the meantime, we've got a lot of work to do right here, and even after we have a national climate policy, we're still going to have a lot of work to do right here, because they're not going to get it done in Washington, D.C. They need to send the right signals, they need to change policy, but we need to do the do right here. Now, I think people struggle with this because the scale issues are so, it doesn't really feel like, it's global warming, let the global people deal with it, right? We're just here in our place. And it's hard to scale our ability to make changes and our ability to do things to the problem. So we realized early on in climate advocacy, we were talking about these big global things and people's eyes were glazing over because they didn't feel like they could do anything about it. So we said, aha! And soon every environmental group had on their website the 10 things that you can do to be part of the solution to global warming. And that helped a little bit, people got to engage. But then after a while, they started coming back to us, and they said, okay, I'm screwed in my light bulb, and I'm turned out the thermostat, but that thing that Al Gore was talking about is so big. Are you sure that the light bulb and the thing that this is really going to work? I mean, is this really going to do it? And so it's critically important that we connect what we're doing locally to a picture that we can believe about what we have to do globally. So I'm going to spend most of the rest of the time talking about the connection between what we do locally and what's going on globally, to try to see if we can make some sense of how to scale this stuff and understand what we're going to do here in this place as part of a global energy revolution at scale. First of all, it is truly an enormous challenge, but there's really nothing very complicated about it. It's about burning fossil fuels. It's about our energy system. This chart takes a little bit of explaining, but it's worth it because it's super important. This is from the International Energy Agency. They are not climate scientists. They are like the leading energy economists in the world. And we're going to come back to these two lines a lot because they help us define the challenge. Here's where we're going. Here's walking off the cliff with our eyes closed. Here's what we'll do if we're serious about having a world we can adapt to. 2 degrees is kind of the universally accepted, globally accepted limit for how far the global average can go before we start experiencing the impacts that we just don't know how to adapt to. So there's the challenge, how to get off of that and how to get to this. Okay, so what the IEA told us is, this blue area is, we have already built the stuff. The coal plants and the roads and the pipelines and the buildings that are going to produce the emissions all the way out to 2035. They're going to produce that much emissions. If we don't do anything different until 2015, which is the 2011 World Energy Outlook, if we just keep going on that same little path as if nothing was happening, by 2011 we would have built all the things that are going to produce the purple emissions too. And by 2017, we'll have built all the things that are going to produce all these emissions. Well, at that point, we're locked in. You can't get out of this stuff. You already spent all your money and all your capital and all your time building the things that are going to produce these emissions. So basically what they're saying is, we have to stop making it worse. Making it better, we got a lot of time to think about how to make it better. But we will never be able to stabilize at a safe level if we don't stop making it worse. I have, for somewhat obvious reasons, coined that principle as the Keystone Principle, after the Keystone Pipeline. And it's basically, if any of you ever used to read Molly Ivins, it's Molly Ivins' first rule for getting out of a hole, right? Stop digging. It's super simple, it's super intuitive. all the solutions, all the things we have to do to make it better, you're going to have a ton of arguments about which technology this and how the economics work. But this part is super duper simple. And, you know, I have to say, in the age of consequences, now that we've seen Sandy, now that we've seen Katrina, now that we've seen tens of millions of people displaced by flooding in Pakistan, I didn't show you their faces because I don't want to kind of go over the top, but they have faces. All those millions of people have faces. And we now have to imagine that we are looking at those people who are displaced from their homes, tornadoes, floods, fires, and telling them something about what we're going to do now. We have to start saying we can make this better. We're going to do what it takes to make it better. They will never believe us unless we stop making it worse. And we have to say the same thing, more importantly, I mean, there's not that much we can say to the Sandy victims, right? It happened. What we can't speak to is the victims of the climate disasters that haven't happened yet. The climate disasters that we can still prevent. Our kids, they are going to be the faces of the disasters that happen if we stay on this line. And the first thing that we have to say to them, if they're going to believe anything we say about solutions, is we're going to stop making it worse. Now, there's a problem with this, right? I drove here to do this presentation today. So I violated the Keystone Principle, right? I made it worse. No. Important distinction. Not everything that we do to make it worse violates the Keystone Principle. We have... it's only the stuff that makes it irrevocably worse. The stuff that's going to drive us into the purple and the yellow and beyond is not driving to the store today. That's already baked in. That car's already built. Practice is already commonplace. I drove to the store yesterday. I'm going to drive to the store again. That's kind of already in the blue stuff. The things that are going to take us over the top are huge, long-term capital infrastructure investments in new fossil fuel infrastructure. Those things don't exist yet. Those are mistakes we haven't made yet. We have the opportunity to not make those mistakes. And it's different than saying, well, I can't drive to the store anymore because I don't want to be part of the problem. That's going to take me a while. I'm going to, I'm going to get an electric car when they become cost effective. I'm going to, try to have better options over time. But tomorrow I'm going to the store because I can eat food. And you're going to the store, and you don't need to feel bad about that. But we do need to feel bad about anything we do that locks us into 20, 30, 40, 50-year infrastructure that makes it irrevocably worse, that locks us into a future that we can't live with and that we can't get back from. That is the Keystone Principle in a nutshell. And it's a key part of making sense of the light bulb and all the things you do in your home, the insulation in your attic. All that stuff is small, it's incremental, it's slow, it's awesome, but it's just going to take forever to make all that stuff happen. We can get there. We have forever. We have 50 years as long as we don't spend these years making it worse. That is why we have to oppose the Keystone Pipeline. So here we are, making it better every day, doing our part, trying to figure out what to do to make it better. These pictures were from Partnership for a Sustainable Methow, and they're sort of oriented toward the food stuff. Local food is great. We're putting up our solar panels. We're insulating our houses. We're figuring out better ways to get from point A to point B. We're building a healthier community. We're reducing our emissions. We're creating jobs. We're making all this wonderful stuff happen in our community, which is great. We're waging this clean energy revolution, which is phasing coal out of our power supply. Awesome. Biggest job driver in Washington State. Healthier communities, cleaner air. This is great for us. This is great for us. It's really bad for the coal industry. So the coal industry has an answer. If we're not going to burn their coal, they're going to take all that coal and 50 times more, ship it on trains through the Columbia River Gorge, out to newly built terminals along the West Coast, and ship it in unimaginable quantities to the fast-growing energy markets in Asia. That is what they propose to do with the coal that we're not going to burn because we had sort of thought that it was pretty important to keep it in the ground. This is called the coal export. How many people know about coal export and these projects? Most people do. Some people don't. Okay. This is the biggest. This is our Keystone. This is bigger than Keystone from a carbon perspective. And it's the biggest battle going on in many communities in the Northwest. You don't have train tracks here, but if you did, you would know a lot about this, because they're talking about a lot of trains. Let me give you a sense of scale of what they're proposing. This is the Boardman coal plant in Oregon. Huge coal plant, the only one in Oregon. It burns 3 million tons a year of coal. I should have brought my pictures of the 3 million ton coal pile. A lot of coal in that coal plant. This one is also scheduled to be phased out. How much coal are they planning on shipping through the Northwest to export to Asia from our ports? Now imagine that each one of those is 3 million tons of coal. They're talking about 150 million tons a year of coal through our ports. And the thing about this, again, that I want to emphasize that's so important is, it's not just that it would be 150 million tons in a year. It's that in order to burn that 150 million tons, they have to build all those coal plants over in Asia, instead of building a clean energy future to power their economy. Once they build those coal plants, every one of those 50 burns that much for 50 years. So now divide each one of those little things into 50, and that's the consequence of this coal export proposal. This is what's called locking into dangerous climate disruption, and we have to stop it. This is the mistake that we can't make if we're going to have all our local solutions add up. And there is a huge campaign to stop it, a very inspiring and successful campaign so far. Communities all over the Northwest are rising up to oppose this, and I'll give you the link for it a little bit later. So I'm going to start to wrap now, and I want to get us back to our little picture of how we're going to solve this. And a couple more slides. Okay, so remember our red line and our green line, business as usual and stabilization from the IEA graph. So how are we going to get our arms around, what we have to do and what we have to stop here? Well, the first thing is, business as usual is a fiction. I mean, this is just a statistical projection of what happens if we keep walking toward that cliff with our eyes closed. But at some point, there really isn't a cliff. You can't just kind of keep walking up there. Remember what they said about organized global community not being possible. Somewhere along this line, that stuff starts to happen. This is not a future that is possible even if we wanted it. So this idea of business as usual is sort of a fiction that I think we need to get over. And that, I think, is part of how we can kind of get our heads around the whole sum of solutions. We actually work with cities where we do this. We do a carbon plan for small cities and big cities where we start with, here's your current emission trajectory, here's where you have to get. And they look at those two lines and they go, oh, that's a long way from all the way up there to all the way down there. Well, you can't get all the way up there. It's physically impossible to burn all that fossil fuel. So let's start with a new business as usual. Remember our Keystone principle. First, stop making it worse. All that other stuff, all the changes we have to make from our lifestyles and our current existing infrastructure, you don't have to do that overnight. All that stuff's going to take time. Some of it's going to be inconvenient, and some of it's going to cost money, and nobody expects everybody to do that overnight. But we have to get a new business as usual in order to make it possible to do all those good things and get where we want to go. And once we make that decision, all the stuff that we do to actually make up that distance from the yellow arrow to where we need to go is great stuff. But we have to get very serious about making sure we don't make those mistakes in the short term. So this is sort of the kind of chart and paradigm I've been using. And I'm sorry, I just think in wedges. These are called climate stabilization wedges, and it's too long working with climate solutions. But this is kind of what works for me about how you put together our contribution in the things we have to stop to make a plan that works at scale. How's our time?
It is 8:07.
Okay. I want to talk about, I'm not going to talk about all those cool solutions in the green space, but I want to talk about one because it's my favorite. And I warned you that I was going to do this. And it's the one that we talk about the least because it's the hardest to understand. It's the energy we don't use. It's far and away the best solution. You can imagine producing enough solar energy to meet your needs if you're not wasting half of it, right? The rest of the advanced world, the rich economies in the world, use about half as much energy to produce perfectly comfortable lifestyles as we do. We can figure out how to do that, and we're doing it. So, let me tell you a little story. This is about the history of energy conservation. This is, of course, President Carter, a room with this demographic. I don't have to explain that, fortunately. In 1978, in a famous speech, President Carter went on TV and declared the moral equivalent of war in the oil crisis and urged everybody to conserve. In energy conservation circles, this was regarded as a fatal mistake. That first of all, he declared it a moral issue. It's not about technology, it's not about practical solutions, it's a lecture, it's a moral issue. And he went on and he made it a kind of an ethical thing instead of a practical thing. He made it a scolding instead of a transition and a practical thing. And so people in the energy conservation world say, we can never ever do that again. We have to, first of all, don't even call it conservation, call it energy efficiency. It's not about your lifestyle, it's not about the choices you make, it's about what technology you use. Now there's a time and a place for that. But I have to say that I've come to the conclusion that Jimmy Carter's mistake was not making it a moral issue. It is a moral issue. It matters what kind of lifestyles we live. It matters what kind of choices we make. It matters how wasteful we are. It's also a technology issue. We can get all the heat and light we need with things that use a lot less energy. So it's both, but the mistake wasn't the moral issue. The mistake was that damn sweater. I mean, look at that. It's yellow. You know? You wouldn't catch a bald eagle dead wearing that thing, right? I mean, now remember, 1978 was a unique moment in American history. It was, remember, malaise, it was Jimmy Carter was a fine man, and I don't mean to diminish his legacy at all, but this was a moment of national regret and recrimination. We were all talking ourselves down, the hostages were never coming home, we were talking about malaise, and then Ronald Reagan was elected, it was Morning in America, and we kind of got our mojo back. People remember this as a really awful moment in American history. And all that sort of bad talk about ourselves, all that lack of confidence in the American psyche, sort of rubbed off on the sweater. I mean, there's no more potent symbol of the failure of American exceptionalism than that sweater. So I just imagine I ask you to imagine what it might have been like had instead of it been Jimmy Carter wearing a sweater. It was, shall we say, some rather more potent symbols of American exceptionalism. I mean, energy conservation has this huge marketing problem, and I say this, in part because, for humor, but also in part to make the point that it really is about culture and how we identify with how we are as people, and whether we're living a good life or not, and how that good life connects ultimately to our energy choices. As long as we think that we have to have 500 horsepower under the hood to have any virility. I grew up in LA in the 1970s, and man, sexual marketability was 100% a function of how many cubic inches you had under your hood, right? As long as that's the kind of culture we have, it's going to be very hard to make this transition. We can create a different kind of culture. And it's not just, obviously, sex isn't the only psychological reward associated with this transition, but, it's there, so you might as well use it. All right. So, let me see what we can do here with this theme. Energy efficiency is like the most notoriously unsexy thing in the world. So I just have to remind you what this is about, because I'm now going to show you this wonky slide about the amazing energy efficiency success story in the Northwest. We started doing energy codes and energy conservation programs. You won. In the early 80s, this is what we've achieved out to 2010. We're about, at 2013, we're about 5,000 average megawatts now. This is in all 4 Northwest states, how much energy we've saved on a continuous basis. It's as if we built 5,000 megawatt nuclear plants with the energy that we don't waste in our buildings now because of this. And again, we're saving $2 billion a year because of this. This is enough to power almost 5 cities the size of Seattle. Of course, there's only 1 city the size of Seattle in the Northwest. So this is the mainstay of our energy program over the last 20 years. And there's plenty more where this came from. Now, I'm only going to show you one more energy efficiency slide. This slide you can get expelled from PowerPoint school for showing this slide. So I just have to give it this caption in order for you to just keep focused, stay with me. You're going to hate it, but it's really important for me. How sexy is that? Come on. This is it turns out to be a famous slide. It was developed by McKinsey and Company, the famous business consulting company. And what they did was they created an abatement curve for climate. They basically said, let's think of all the things we have to do and how much of them we have to do to get to that and adapt and survive. And so they took all this stuff, and you probably can't read them, but it's just a whole bunch of different solutions. And then they lined them up according to their cost. So all the things that down here below zero, all the things from here left, all that is negative cost. That's money back in our pockets. So even if there were no climate change, these would be things that we ought to be doing on economic grounds alone. And almost all of them are about wasting less. It's more efficient appliances, LED lights, better motors, more efficient cars, building efficiency, retrofits, all great stuff. Great for the economy, great for our communities, the most important part of the climate solution. And that'll put some money in our pocket to pay for some of the exotic stuff. By the way, I'm not endorsing all of these. I'm just telling you, that's McKinsey's cost abatement curve. The one other solution I'll mention, just because it's so here, it's so twist, is what's going on with solar. Solar technology is just dropping in cost by leaps and bounds. It's really quite amazing to see what's going on with solar technology. Why is that happening? There's a two-word shorthand for the answer. Ellen Ellen, unfortunately, is not alone. There are Ellen Lammerman-like people, not quite as good as Ellen, but there are people all over the country doing community solar programs. You can now crowdsource solar. You can go on the web and be like a solar bank for a solar project anywhere at mosaic.com. And this stuff is really taking off. It's a fabulous technology. It is the biggest game changer among the clean energy technologies. And it's a game changer in part because of the physics of it, but also in part because of the democratization of it. It enables us to move to an energy system where people can control their energy destiny in a fundamentally different way. And because of that amazing work, Methow was awarded this award, Best Community Solar Projects. The solar production per capita in Methow is as good as any place ever. Ellen and I were just arguing about the numbers a little bit when we came in, but they're huge. And it's all a tribute to, it's the technology and all that, but it's really a tribute to community organizing. These are community financed. There are people getting together to make this stuff happen in their community, and solar is uniquely suited to that. There's lots of other good solutions, but that's a great one. So the first climate solution is this rapid transition off of clean energy, use less, use solar, all these other great technologies. We're also starting to explore a climate solutions, the second climate solution, which is biocarbon. Soaking more carbon back into healthy forests, healthy soils, healthy ecosystems that can store a lot of the carbon that's up there. If you know 350.org, 350 parts per million is sort of the safe limit for climate pollution in the atmosphere. We're already at 400. So even after we stop putting it up there, we got to suck some of it back. And this is one of the best ways to do it while helping us build the kind of communities we want to build, particularly in rural areas, with healthy forests, greener urban areas, the bioeconomy, waste, recycling, soil building, agriculture. Great stuff. You can find out more about that. And this might be one of the most interesting solutions for the Methow at the new Northwest Biocarbon Initiative on the Climate Solutions website. So you do wonder about this, right? Mm-hmm. I get asked this all the time. And I think, when I think about all the obstacles we face, all the, Exxon and politics and money and all that stuff, I think fatalism is the biggest. I think people worrying that we've just gone too far and it's too late. Jim Hansen, our most famous climate scientist, in May in the New York Times wrote an article about the Keystone Pipeline and said if we build the Keystone Pipeline, it's quote-unquote game over for the climate. And what he meant was that whole thing about lock-in that I was talking about. You build that infrastructure, you can't get back. But game over for the climate is really kind of an unfortunate set of words, right? I mean, we haven't even really started hardly playing yet. And it's a little demoralizing to think that somebody, one of our best scientists could be saying something is game over. It's an important point because it shows you that point where we lock in to the really bad outcomes. But the truth is, A, it's not a game, and B, it's never over. If we go over 2 degrees centigrade, do we just throw up our hands and say, oh, well? No, because 3 degrees is a lot worse, logarithmically worse, exponentially worse than 2, and 4 is worse than 3. And what we do now is the difference between how far we go. It's going to be hard to stop at 2 degrees. We might not be able to do it. So do we say, oh, well, game over, and press reset and go on to a new game? No. We still have the challenge of doing what we can in our time. And these are the decisions that we're going to make. So before we say game over, how about we say a little bit game on to what we can do about climate? And that is exactly what the president did last week in his climate announcement. I've been waiting for that speech for a long time. It's not everything. There's still lots of problems. It's not a whole new ballgame. But what you heard from the president is fundamentally different than what we've ever heard from a national leader before. I can tell you more about the plan, but it's, look, you can yap until the cows come home, but if you won't put limits, responsible limits, on the biggest source of pollution, then it's just lips flapping in the breeze. I mean, this is not complicated. This is the obvious part of climate policy. The president stepped up to it last week. Keystone, he said, none of us were expecting to say anything about Keystone. He said, we will not approve Keystone if it makes climate disruption worse. That sounds a lot like the Keystone Principle. Does it mean he's not going to approve the Keystone Pipeline? We don't know. There's lots of interpretations. I'm happy to go into both explanations with you if you want. But he established a very important principle. Nobody in the federal government has said that about coal export yet. And if you think about really applying that principle, we're not going to do anything that makes it worse. That is a whole new ballgame. Can we hold them to that principle? Can we deliver on that principle? We'll find out, but we've got it out there now, and it's not just me saying it. Energy efficiency and renewables are, nothing fancy or revolutionary in the president's plan, but good solid steps forward. That's the bread and butter. We know how to do this stuff. Talked about international leadership. Some very important small pieces of international leadership are in there. The world is desperately waiting. I can tell you I've been to those international negotiations, and people just come up to you just practically begging. Get your Senate to do something. Move America. We need America to move. You'd think they'd be screaming at the top of their lungs, but they're not. They're saying we need you. The president's pledged to start stepping up to that. There's plans in there for adaptation and resilience. I didn't talk about that a lot today. You may be interested in that. It's important. Some of these changes are already in the pipeline. We're seeing them now. We've got some things to adapt to. The reason I don't emphasize it, frankly, is because I think this other stuff comes first. We don't even know what to adapt to until we stabilize the climate. This is an urgent necessity, and we've got to do some adaptation. We can talk more about that too. And a part of the plan itself was his body language. I don't know if you saw the speech, but it was really quite great. It was way better than I expected. He broke a sweat, which was great. He had his sleeves rolled up. He leaned into it. He was taking no crap from anybody about it. He talked for 50 minutes. He really had a conversation. He said to that woman in the focus group, somebody's doing something about it. Screw in your light bulb, because leaders are starting to lead. We're going to adopt solutions at scale. Be part of it. It doesn't make any sense to be part of it if there's nothing to be part of, right? But now there's starting to be something to be part of. But I will tell you, as much as I hate to admit it, it's a fight. I have to say, I've been criticized for this. I am a lover more than a fighter by nature. I love working on solar projects with Ellen Landman. I love doing solutions. I love working with my community. I love making this stuff happen. I love building bridges to people who frankly don't want to talk about climate change because they think it's a political conspiracy. And there's so much you can do with love. There's so much you can do by being all about solutions and putting out the soft part of this. But we're to the point now where we have to have this fight because we have to stop making it worse. And there are people who are determined to make it worse. Some of those people are at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which I have to tell you is no longer, your mom and pop business association. They have become kind of like a money laundering operation for the fossil fuel industry. The Seattle Chamber of Commerce withdrew from the US Chamber of Commerce because they are so bad on climate policy. But this is the voice of business in Washington, D.C. What did they say when the EPA had its big finding that climate endangers public health and we have to do something about it? Population is going to climatize to warmer climates by a range of behavioral, and physiological, and technological adaptations. Now I said we have to do some adapting, and indeed we do. But I will be damned if I'm going to change my physiology so that Exxon doesn't have to change its business plan. I mean, what are we, like going to grow gills or scales or what? So they can keep digging up fossil fuels and skinning us at the pump so that we have the privilege to buy them? No. This is a fight. We have to have this fight. We have to win this fight. The Koch brothers, who are basically a fossil fuel industry, spent as much on the 2012 election as the entire McCain campaign spent in 2008. This is a, whatever issue you care about, this is a serious threat to our democracy. I was in Washington, D.C. I testified in the House of Representatives last week. And I can tell you, they are not on the verge of doing anything about climate because half or more of them are owned by the fossil fuel industry. And this is not a partisan statement. They've got their hooks plenty deep into both parties. We do not have a functional democracy in this country. We can't take votes on issues. We can't reform the filibuster. It's true. Those guys talk. And nowhere is it more egregious than on fossil fuels. Well, making this clean energy transition is a way to take our money. It's a way to take our power back. Every time you figure out how to use an alternative form of transportation, how to get a more efficient car, is a time you do not have to march up to the gas pump and send these people your money so they can do more of this. This is the kind of transition we can make. Is it going to save the world when you get a little bit more efficient car? No. But you are going to be able to say, I am not going to put my money, my power, my will into the people who are determined to make it worse. This is how we take our democracy back, it's how we take our climate back, it's how we take our power back. So let's just add it all up and finish it up. So there's our little schematic. Hope it's working for you like it's working for me. First thing we do is determine to stop making it worse, and then, look how much easier it just got. You don't have to get all the way from there. You didn't make all those mistakes yet. You don't have to make those mistakes. We can just open our eyes, look at the people who are suffering already, and say, we're not going there. We can't go. We couldn't physically go there. And besides, if we go there, that's just pouring our money out of this community. When you pull up to the gas pump, and you take your money and you stick it in the gas pump, where does it go? Straight out of the bottom of a hole in the economy. Nobody you know is going to get a job because you spent that money. Nothing good is going to happen in the community because you spent that money. People say, oh, we're going to get off foreign oil. It's all foreign. You think Exxon's going to do anything better for the Methow Valley because they drilled it in North Dakota or in the Alberta tar sands instead of Venezuela? It is all foreign to us. So we can get off of that. We don't have to choose that red line anymore. And all of a sudden, now we've got time. Now we don't have to beat ourselves up every time we go to the store. Now we don't have to, people don't have to look up, I feel like, the one thing I did not sign up for when I became a climate advocate is that every time I come up to somebody and their car is idling, they go, oh, shh, turn off the ACs. People feel compelled to tell me, oh, I've got so much insulation. They show me their house, tell me how much insulation. Look, I'm a slob, just like the rest of you, okay? I'm making this transition. Nobody's got a high horse to ride on. This is not a lifestyle lecture. We can all do this together. We've got time to do it if we stop making it worse. And it's going to be awesome. We are going to build a much healthier, fundamentally better, more sustainable life for ourselves by doing these things. And we have to stand up and keep standing out right now. All right, so let's do some of the good stuff first. You can always go to climatesolutions.org, lots of good stuff there. We do a lot of work on state climate policy initiatives. You're going to see that accelerating the next year. We have outstanding leadership on the West Coast that's committed to doing this. So carbon taxes, carbon limits, carbon prices, I believe are the most important policy solution. We started down that road in 2009, we got a little sidetracked, but I think we're back on the road to having a serious discussion about this in the state legislature. You'll see us working hard on that next year. All this other stuff you're already doing in this community, and all the stuff you can do. You know, the transportation stuff, I just think, again, in terms of taking our power back, our money, our democracy, and fundamentally restoring our sense of self-determination, I love that about alternative transportation. I love that about riding my bike. I love being able to breathe. I love the whole thing. But I really love the fact that I am no longer the prisoner of this fossil fuel tyranny when I manage to do something other than go buy oil for my car. And I'm not going to feel like the biggest sinner in the world every time I have to fill up the car, because I still got to get to the Methow, and there aren't enough charging stations between here and the Methow. So, you know, this is going to be a transition. I won't, you know, we could talk more about this stuff, but we should wrap. This is the good stuff that's happening in the valley. This is what it looks like. You're doing this stuff now. I listened to the route this morning, and it was, we're bumping the recycling rate up from 10 to 20. You know, we can't do it as fast as the urban areas, but we're making steady progress, and people are super committed to doing it. What was the other thing I heard on the route this morning? It was great. I can't remember. You know, the local food stuff, all of that. That's what it looks like to build a sustainable community. When we wrest control of our democracy back from the fossil fuel industry, when we make a global clean energy transition, what are we going to be doing? We're going to be doing what you're doing here in Methow, only more of it. We're going to have more resources, and the incentives are going to be better. It's going to be awesome. And I strongly urge you, if you care about the Methow, if you're committed to these solutions in your own life, help us do what needs to be done politically and at the policy level to make sure that we stop making it worse. PowerPassCoal.org is the campaign to stop coal export. You probably know about the Keystone XL campaign. Bill McKibben will be in Vancouver on July 17th. He'll actually be talking about the coal export campaign, but he's leading the Keystone XL campaign at the same time. 350.org is a fantastic organization. They are also running a divestment campaign. You may have heard the president very briefly say divest in his speech. This is what he was talking about. This is a campaign on college campuses across the country to get college trustees to divest their portfolios from fossil fuels. This is something that we can all do as individuals and in our organizations. If you have a mutual fund, if you have any of those sort of blended assets or any of that stuff, something that's in fossil fuels. Do we have to drop it all tomorrow? No. Do we have to get out of our cars tomorrow? No. But calling your investment person and saying, hey, I'm not too happy about sending my money to Exxon so they can buy good climate science and buy off Congress. What do you got besides Exxon? It's good for them to start hearing that, and I think it's going to make a huge difference. It's one of those things that really crystallizes for people. Aha, I don't have to feed the beast. I've got other places to put my money. So those are three great campaigns that keep us from getting it worse. And let me just close with this. We started coming here in 91 was, I think, the first time we came. The year our daughter was born. We came up in the winter, a couple months after she was born, and we drove up, and we got here at about 3 in the afternoon, which of course is twilight in the winter. We stayed at the base camp. We got to the base camp, and our daughter was tiny, 2-3 months old, and we had time for one of us to go out for a ski, and the other one to stay with the daughter. So I stayed with our daughter, and Christy went out for a ski. And up until that time, we've been together, I don't know, 6 or 8 years at that point. And we've been looking, keeping our eyes open for our special place in the West. But we were nomads and Renaissance people in our 20s, and so we weren't ready to settle down. But by the time our daughter came, we were starting to say, be a good time to start finding that special place in the West. So Christy went out for a ski up in what is now Arrowleaf, and skied around trails in Arrowleaf and came back to the base camp, and she said to me, this is it. And there was very little question about it from that moment on. This is it for us. This is it, for so many of you. And it's it for some pretty exceptional and great reasons. We are super fortunate to have this. And I think we, more than most people, have a really strong attachment to our place because we've got such an awesome place. And maybe because we're the kind of people who wanted to have that kind of attachment to a place. But you don't see that everywhere. There's signs all over the Zama now for the shake your butt to move the hut. right? There's a fundraiser for the Move the Hut project, that kind of thing. And people, there's these, flyers out and listservs and fundraisers and lawsuits and people calling each other on Hillside. Now, I support that. I think we should do that. But that kind of sense of attachment to your place, that you would get that excited about it, or all the things this valley has done, all the things the Methow Conservancy has done, all the time and energy and love and commitment and fierceness at times that you've had to put in to keep this place. Those are the things that we have to muster in, that we have to bring to bear in ourselves, not just for the Conservancy, not just to move the hut, but to keep things from getting worse, and to make ourselves an example of what it looks like to make these solutions real in our lives. And I don't think there's a better place to do it on earth. Thank you very much.